Somewhere between 15 and $20 trillion of global GDP is going to be added in the next 5 years. ChatGPT gets released in November 2022, and today it's hit the world. These models that are being predominantly developed in two places, San Francisco and Beijing, predominantly being developed by a bunch of white dudes and a bunch of Chinese dudes. There are a few Indian dudes in there.
Technology colonialism is a problem. It's a material problem in terms of outcomes, but also an ethical problem. There's four groups that'll probably solve it. It'll be the foundation model creators, it'll be the buyers, it'll be maybe investors, and lastly, some regulatory or legislative approach.
The most populous country in the world has one of the lowest accesses to internet in the world, which means they have one of the lowest representations of their data in these models.
Hello and welcome to BetterTech Podcast. I'm Jocelyn Houle, your host, and today we're super excited to be welcoming Dr. Seth Dobrin, the founder and CEO of Quantum AI. And today, welcome, Seth. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
You propose a pretty big topic, technological colonialism and how to prevent cultural homogenization at a global scale. A lot of big concepts there, which I definitely want to dive into immediately. But maybe we should just sort of start with you and a little bit about your background.
Yeah. So, first of all, Jocelyn, thanks for having me. Super excited to be here and speak with you and your audience. I've been in the AI space since the mid-90s. I'm actually a human geneticist by training, and most people scratch their head and go, human genetics, AI, what does that have to do with each other? I did my PhD during the tail end of the Human Genome Project. And that's one of the first places that AI actually jumped out of math and computer science into real-world applications. The other was astrophysics. In fact, if you look at the two languages that are predominant in AI today, two coding languages, one is Python, which was developed in the physics realm. The other is R, which was developed in the biological sciences, particularly genetics and genomics world. And so I've been applying these tools since the mid late 90s, early 2000s, in and out of academics, research labs, startups. After that, I started working in Fortune 500 companies at Monsanto. Ultimately became IBM's chief AI officer, where I was responsible for AI across the whole company. And in 2016, I left IBM to start my own advisory firm called Quantum AI, which focuses on AI strategy, AI governance, and educating senior executives and government leaders around the world, particularly in Fortune 500 companies, private equity firms, and governments. I also have a venture fund, or one of four partners in a venture fund called One Infinity Ventures, focuses on deep tech AI, responsible AI. It's a $500 million global fund that really is aimed to, one of the primary objectives is to help address this topic we're talking about today, which is technological colonialism.
Great. I have lots of questions on the business side, but I think the focus really where we should start is on this ideological thought leadership side. Tell me a little bit about how you're defining technological colonialism. First of all, find out how you got interested in it.
Yeah. So, this whole concept of things like, bias and demographic disparities in the output of the models, has been a conversation that's been going on for a long time, right? Who's developing the models? Who's using the models? They're not equivalent, right? It hasn't been for a long time. So we see a bunch of white dudes and Chinese dudes and Indian dudes primarily being the people who are developing AI systems. And it's been that way for a long time. And historically, that's been a problem. Been predominantly men, predominantly white men with some Chinese men and some Indian men, so primarily developers of these models, regardless of where they're getting implemented. That's been an issue. Now, fast forward to 2017. So 2017 is the birth of these pre-trained models, foundation models. This is when transformer architecture, which is the basis of ChatGPT and all these other generative AI systems, became common. And the reason I'm fast forwarding there is because this is when we start loading all of these AI systems with data. So they're getting preloaded with data. And now let's fast forward to November 2022, where now we have these things getting into the mainstream. So ChatGPT gets released in November 2022. And today it's hit the world, right? It's mainstream. And so now we have these models that are being predominantly developed in two places, San Francisco and Beijing, predominantly being developed by a bunch of white dudes and a bunch of Chinese dudes. There are a few Indian dudes in there. And primarily being developed by data, or exclusively being developed by data that's scraped off the internet and social media. And if you look at a graph of where, people who have access to the internet, there's large swaths of the population in the global population that don't have access to the internet. So you have large swaths of the globe whose data is not represented. So now you have a problem where you have a small minority of people who are developing these models that don't represent the globe, developing systems based on data that doesn't represent the globes, with the technology that potentially has the ability, if you listen to all the analysts, to revolutionize and transform how we're going to operate in the future. And so you're inflicting the small minority of people's perspectives based on this small minority of data, perspectives in the data on the rest of the world. And so that's the whole basis of what I'm thinking about as technological colonialism. And it's no different than going back to colonial eras where you're using technology. The difference is the technology back then was ships, cannons, and guns to inflict your ethos, and the time it was religion and language, on the rest of the world. And if you look at the results of that today, the UK, English, England, France, Spain, and Portugal, right? Their population makes up less than 2% of the global population. Yet those four languages represent, the top, 4 of the top 10 languages in the world.
I love hearing about all this, and I want to talk about a million things while you're speaking. So let me kind of break this into 3 parts, because I think what you're saying is, okay, we've got all these foundational models that are trained on a specific type of data, right? And it's leaving out a lot of people. The problem with that, right, is going to fall into 3 different areas. There's a technical problem, a kind of business problem, and then an ethical, cultural problem. Let's just sort of talk at a technical level to start, if that's okay.
Well, there are lots of other core technical problems with the technology besides just that. But yeah, we can talk about this.
That's right. That's right. So you're focusing in on one that people really like to talk about, which is like, hey, the foundation model can only be as, unbiased and high quality as the data it's trained on. First of all, let's kind of do you agree with that statement? I guess would be the first starting.
Yeah. So I do to a certain extent. Now, I do. However, I would also argue that the foundation model itself is not the place where you should control the bias. Now, why is that? Because the foundation model is being pre-trained in one place and you don't know where it's going to be deployed. And bias is a cultural construct. And so let's say the EU mandates that you control bias in a foundation model that's going to get deployed in EU. EU's construct of bias is very different than an Indian cultural construct of bias, which is different than a African cultural construct of bias, which is different than a Chinese, which is different than a South American, which is different than you see where I'm going, right? And so now you're inflicting European construct of cultural bias on the rest of the world because the EU is mandating that you control bias in the model. And so that's not a good solution either. Gotcha.
Right. So technically, I sort of feel like there's this training moment and this inference moment, right? Mm-hmm. And they both have like weights and biases associated with them. And that basically, what you're saying sort of technically, just from a technical perspective, does that make the model better or worse that it is dominated by a few voices, or does that happen downstream?
I think it makes it worse. I think what you want to make sure is that the model is built in a representative fashion, both from a data perspective and from a people who are building it perspective.
That's what I want to just contend. So you think you get a better model? You get a
better model if you have more representation, both from a data perspective and a human perspective.
And why do you think that in particular? I think it's interesting. I'm just pushing on this because you have this biotech and the Monsanto background where you're really dealing with much larger data than most people deal with.
Yeah, you just get different perspectives, right? I mean, you get if you have people from one background and one just one view of the world or even a few views of the world, their mind works the same way. You're going to solve problems very similarly. You're going to come at things and the creativity and the solutions are going to be very limited. Whereas if you bring people in with different backgrounds, different perspectives, different genders, different socioeconomical backgrounds, different ways, different, neurodiversity, different educations, different languages even. All of these things contribute to a richness of thought and ways of solving problems that just create better outcomes, create more innovation. And so I think that is why diversity when embraced, right? Just having diversity doesn't solve that. Diversity and inclusivity and belonging, when it's embraced, that solves it. Just having a bunch of women and a bunch of black and brown people on the team doesn't solve anything. They have to be part of the team.
Yeah, I'm actually sort of selfishly asking that question because I got taken to task on this recently. So I think what you're saying is you have to have a diversity of data and a diversity of opinion. Both things really matter. And I think what I hear you saying is diversity writ large, not just diversity in some typical way that we might think of it. One of my things I always like to bring in, because I'm getting pretty long in the tooth, I've been doing this a long time, is, we also like diversity for younger people who don't have experience, right? We're always oh, you don't know the domain, you can't be part of it. In some ways, those people are the most effective.
Yeah.
So, that's my 2 cents on that, but because it's such an interesting topic. So technically, we feel like we get a better model, we get better outcomes, right, from adding diversity. And then culture, I think what you're saying, and then there's benefits overall when you consider the impacts of AI, right?
Yes, the impacts of AI. And if we're truly building a language model that's supposed to represent the world, right? It should have data that represents the world, right? It shouldn't be built on, if you look at a map of access to the internet, India has one of the lowest levels of access to the internet. The most populous country in the world has one of the lowest accesses to internet in the world, which means they have one of the lowest representations of their data in these models.
So let's get into that, because I think there's an interesting cross-section here of a technical problem and an operational problem that comes into play when you try and address this. So I'm just thinking about, okay, you and I are sitting around at OpenAI. We're okay, we're going to solve this problem. We maybe went down a path that was a little biased to start with, and now we want to solve it. Sort of operationally, what could you even do to address this issue starting from now?
Well, so, these companies are raising a tremendous amount of money, right? And they're raising all this money to develop new technologies. When I was at IBM, we spent a lot of money intentionally acquiring data and paying for that data. And I think, some of these other companies that have been going around and just scraping data off the internet and acquiring it, they should spend the time now and go and fill in some of the gaps in their data and go and figure out how can they go to these places in the world that don't have access to the internet, and how can they go collect some data about these cultures, about these societies. Go spend some of this $6.6 billion that has just been raised and spend $500 million on it. Go generate and go see how they can turn some of the non-digital data in sub-Saharan Africa into digital data. See how they can turn some of the data in the most populous non-digital data in the most populous country in the world into digital data and get it trained into their model. I think that would be valuable for them, and that would be valuable for the world if their goal is to really create, AGI that's safe. Then let's create AGI that's safe for the world and represents the world and understands the world.
So I guess what we'd have to do, right, is just have this premise hey, we know there's gaps, and the best case, because there's really no way to understand the gaps today, right? You just have what you have. You can't understand compared to what. There is no great sort of comparison. No one's done this before of having a truly diverse data set. And so you'd have to sort of say well, we know there's gaps. I love your example of sub-Saharan Africa. So we're going to go reap data, right? That's going to help us, particularly at inference time. A lot of times you'll get there and there isn't enough. There's not the same amount of data. This has been said before in other discussions around diversity. Western canon simply has more data because as a result of colonialism and their own dominance, right, it was self-documenting. So there's just a lot more. Have you seen anybody who is effectively maybe getting data or maybe synthetically creating data to balance out?
Yeah. So, I think I've had a few conversations. This isn't the first time I've had this conversation about technological colonialism. And then, inevitably someone, do this around the world. And I've had multiple people from India come up and say, hey, look, we're training models in India that are filling in this gap. So there are people in India that are doing it for India. So the data is there. Someone is getting the data and generating the data.
Okay.
And so it's there. They're just going to need to pay.
There's not a gap in like availability. It's there. It's a gap in the intent to include it.
Well, they just need to go pay for it now because someone has gone and taken the effort to go and figure out how am I going to get this data about these 126 different languages and 1,000 some odd different dialects that exist in India, right? I mean, that's not an exaggeration.
So we have any listeners from an underrepresented country, this could be a great entrepreneurial idea.
Right. So someone in India has already done this, right? They've trained language models to understand all 126 different languages and all the 1,000 different dialects. Now, all these big companies have to do is go pay this company to go license it.
Okay, let's switch gears. But I do like that, and I like that opinion. It's really great to hear that from you because you're spending time with people who are doing this. Sometimes that is a concern that there just isn't data there. So you're saying there definitely is. And I do like the idea of having the big model companies, right, going after this. Have you given some thought about who's most likely to do this? Open source organizations like a Mistral or somebody, like Meta, or is it going to be a more closed approach that are going to say like, hey, this could potentially be an advantage to have more diversity?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, we need to be careful about calling Meta open source. They're pseudo open source, right?
Fair.
I mean, so their model is mostly open source. Their data is not open source, right? And so
correct. That's right. Right.
So I don't think Meta is a truly open source model. I've written about that pretty much. I think we have different degrees of open source models now, and I think we need to there's been many others that have published about this as well.
That's right.
There's now a hierarchy of open source that we need to be more transparent about. I think if you go back to like 2019, 2020. Or 2020, 2021, 2022, there was this big science organization, right? So Bloom was one of the first open source models that came out. And that was a really massive consortium of just academics, individuals that I think we need big science to come back together and figure out how to solve this problem to get the data to come back together. That's where this data set called Pile came from, right? There's this data set that many of the models use called Pile. And so we need a bigger pile.
A bigger pile. Yeah, I like that. I think what I'm kind of getting at is like, so there's a couple of ways to get there, right? Commercial intent. Mm-hmm. One might be the models. And I want to get into this. Like, so we'll talk about commercial, but I also want to talk about maybe like standards bodies, government, or there's like a sort of another kind of way to get there, which is really regulated.
Yeah.
Right. There's kind of two ways, but sticking in the commercial for the moment, because that's where we started, is you've got the model companies or companies with big bets in the model space. And then the other side of that, the other people who could be like making this happen, this diversity, are really the customers of AI, right? They have a ton of power. Fortune 500. What are you hearing from your customers about like degree of interest in diversity at the moment for AI?
Yeah. So I think there's actually, four groups that could drive this. So one we talked about. So one are the frontier model developers, right? So OpenAI, Meta, Google, Anthropic, the Minstrel, that whole group, they could be driving this, and we'll keep those separate because they're an important separate group. The other you're talking about now are the corporates, the customers. So the people, and they have a loud voice because they're the ones that are buying it. The third are the governments, right? And so they can legislate it or regulate it. That's too slow. And I think what's going to happen is you're going to see what's happening in the EU, where they're going to have good intent, but it's going to have bad side effects, right? Where they're going to legislate that you need to control bias in these pre-trained models, which has broader global implications that they don't understand, right? So I don't know that that's necessarily the right solution in this case. I think the legislation should be on outcomes and not on the models themselves. And finally, I think another, similar to the enterprises or the customers, the investors have a very loud voice.
Fair. Right.
And so,
Right.
One of the things that One Infinity that we measure, we have a metric system around responsible AI that we measure all of our startups against to make sure that they're doing things like this. And we use OECD as the basis, AI principles as the basis of our metric system. And global inclusivity is part of the metric system. And so how are startups making sure they're doing that? And so that's an important metric system, and making sure your startups adhere to that's important. So I think those are the 4 different groups. We talked about the first one. I think right now, as far as the customers are concerned, the enterprises, I guess they have the biggest voice.
That's been my experience so far.
I kind of went off on a tangent a little bit, but I think it was.
But that's been my experience so far, right? Is that, I love everybody who works. I have friends who work at all of these big foundation model companies, but at the end of the day, it's the customers demanding it that's going to kind of prioritize.
Yep. For the most part, the enterprise customers are underwater right now. They don't know.
Right.
Most of their boards are demanding they use this technology. They don't know how they're going to use it. They're asking all the wrong questions. The boards are going, you need to use this, and they don't even know. They're not saying, how is it going to add value? So they don't even understand how they're going to use these technologies. And so they don't have time. They haven't thought enough about to ask these questions.
For sure.
And so
who's going to get them to think about it? I think would be my question.
So that's part of why I'm raising these conversations, right? That's part of why I talk about this on stage all the time. I talk about this when I talk with my customers. I teach at NYU and at one of the City University of New York. So I talk to all my students about this. So I talk about this all the time. I think it's an important topic. I write about it. Others are starting to talk about it. So I'm glad to see that after 18 months of me talking about it, others are starting to talk about it. And so It's a topic that's becoming more and more visible. So hopefully it will start to get addressed.
I think it has to become visible. Personally, my 2 cents is, I'm always like a technology maximalist, is that it makes the commercial reason to do this is the same thing as open source. There's a commercial reason you care about having more voices and more input, is that the outcomes are fundamentally better, not just ethically better, but they're actually just like measurably better.
Yeah, ethics aside, the right thing aside, you just get better outcomes.
You get better outcomes.
You get better outcomes, and it's by the way, it's the right thing to do, right? I mean, it's one of those things.
Correct. Just want to kind of like shine a little bit of a light on that for our listeners and for any CEOs who are listening to this and thinking like, oh, I forgot to ask this question. Here's what you can tell your board, is that it's, materially better.
Yeah.
Not just ethically, right?
Now I want to take a little bit of a step to the side, though.
Okay.
All right. So, the whole industry is enamored with these large language models, right? These large language models are built on a technology that was never intended to be a large language model. This whole technology was developed to be a small model to translate one language to another language. That was it. All of the issues we see with this technology are derived from the fact that they took a task-specific technology and are trying to make it do everything. And so, So what we're seeing, or what we will see in the future, is we're going to see a move away from these large language models to small models. And in fact, if you look at return on investment on these large language models, there's most cases it's going to be little to none to negative, because the cost of ownership is very, very high, especially when you get into RAG. Everyone talks about RAG.
Right.
To implement RAG, you have to make 5 calls minimum for every one query.
Right. It's heavy.
Properly.
Heavy
and so you're 5 API calls for one query. So
right, we're not going to be setting that up at the credit card swipe, right?
Right. And so small models solve a lot of the problems with the same technology, and then eventually we'll move away from this technology. So you don't need these big language models. They're not the answer for most solutions.
I like what you're saying, mostly because I agree with it, of course. But I like what you're saying, because I do think if you follow kind of the top thought leaders in this space, the idea is that here's where we're headed. It's going to be smaller models at the edge. It's going to be smaller models running inside of organizations on something smaller than a supercomputer, right? And so for cost reasons, but also because for reasons of like protecting IP. But this makes your topic even more important, right? Because then here's where that lands you. If you're running a company and you're like, hey, you know what? We're going to run our own small model internally, right? Jocelyn Houle's model for customer service. Then that means I'm actually setting up all the weights. I'm determining what are, how, diverse the inputs will actually be by selecting that foundation model. And then on top of it, I have a sort of separate discussion of like, what am I doing in my organization to make sure it's representative?
But it actually helps you solve that problem a little easier because now you can have a small model for a set of small models for Europe, a small set of small models for Africa, a set of small models for different parts that don't cost, $500 million to train, right? You can, they cost a lot less to train. And actually what you find too is that, interestingly, these small models on those tasks that they're trained on tend to outperform even in some cases.
I just learned this the other day.
So you can get very small, like very, very small, like megabyte, like 10,000 parameter models trained on a very specific task that outperform GPT-4o on that task. And so, I
thought that was going to take a lot longer, actually, but here we are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're training it on massive amounts of data on that one topic, whereas GPT-4o is trained on even more massive amounts of data, but it's on everything. And so, it's just, so that's why, those 10 million parameters that model is trained on is those parameters all have to do with that one topic, right? And now these transformer architectures will always hallucinate. It's just a default part of their system, but now the hallucination rate is 0.00001% instead of, the best we've seen is like, 15% hallucination rate with all of the controls in there, right? So, because you're so focused with the data, the hallucination rate is minuscule.
That's right. I think that'll get solved in those by use case specifics. That's right.
Yeah.
So let's review the architecture of this argument. Technology colonialism, it's a problem. It's a material problem in terms of outcomes, but also an ethical problem. There's four people, right, groups that'll probably solve it. It'll be the foundation model creators, it'll be the buyers, it'll be maybe investors, and lastly, some regulatory or legislative approach. Great. Let's jump into the next part of the narrative, which is, let's assume everybody is a good actor. Seth, you got your way. Everybody's doing this. They went to India, they bought the models, right? Everybody's doing your thing. Now let's jump to the other side of the fence. Like, how do we know it's really happening? Right? What are some technological trends that you're tracking? Because that would be the next question I would have is how do you know what you're doing today is measurably better, is actually inclusive? Like, what do you do?
Yeah. So I think that's a really hard question to answer. I think again, because we haven't seen these being used at scale, and that's a good thing because we know there's core issues with them. So we haven't seen them used to make credit decisions yet, or we haven't seen them used to make direct hiring decisions yet. And so I think what we want to be able to continue to measure things that we measure in those health, wealth, and livelihood decisions that it's called disparate impact, right? And we want to make sure, which is where you don't look at measuring. This gets back to my point about measuring the outcomes. As you measure the models, we measure the outcomes, where you look at the entire AI system and you look at what is the impact at the point of decision. And so when you're looking at, okay, if we're making a decision about a mortgage, what is the disparity between two groups that occurs in the whole system? So what is the disparate impact?
Yeah.
Right. And so you can look, will we notice there's a difference? Well, if we have things in production before they do this and we have things in production after, and we look around the world, I'm sure we'll see a difference. I don't have any, empirical evidence of today because there is no empirical evidence of today other than the fact that we know there is no data trained in, there's a dearth of data. I shouldn't say no, but there's a dearth of data from India. There's a dearth of data from sub-Saharan Africa. There's a dearth of data that represents parts of South America. There's a dearth of data that represents, some parts of the Middle East. There's a dearth of data that represents some other parts of, Southwest Asia. So, we know there are gaps in data from parts of the world. So these models do not understand their cultures, their languages, their ways of life. We know that for a fact. And so we know those aren't in there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I thought I was on. One of the questions I had, what we're seeing with some of our customers and some of the folks that I work with is organizations are really setting up test beds, right, to sort of take a snapshot of how it's working today and kind of create a baseline.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's something we're seeing. It's a sort of rude elementary tool. Hopefully there'll be better tools for identifying bias and hallucination in the future. But right now, that's what most, particularly regulated organizations, because I work a lot with financials, that's the best they can come up with is like sort of snapshotting the training data and the outcomes at different times and then measuring back what the diffs were. Have you seen any other strategies in this space?
Yeah, I mean, so that gets to a whole nother issue with these models when you get into regulatory environments, right? So historically in regulatory environments, when a regulator comes in and you made a decision in the past, right? Mm-hmm. You had a snapshot of what was going on in the past as to how you made a decision. Now, with these large models, you don't necessarily know when changes were made. How are you going to snapshot and how are you going to justify how you made that decision?
Right, because on the data side, right, we used to have straight-through processing. Even at a very large scale, even if it was complicated, you could sort of vaguely, if you really put your elbow grease into it, you could back out how you came to a particular decision on a particular day. Right. Now, I would say it was already happening with the world of cloud complexity, but now with AI, it's non-deterministic.
Right.
The outcome, you can't trace it back. So, like, how would you know, like, let's say you did have international regulatory bodies, like you have to be able to show that you are truly diverse in the data you're using for training. It would be interesting to figure out, like, what would be the ways to test that? Yeah. Or even if
even when we were using just even old school machine learning, so pre-2023, right, as I call it. Even when we were building our own AI systems, right?
I'm not sure I feel about that. I feel old when you say that, but okay, go ahead.
You would maintain your own old versions of your models, right? And so you would have, okay, we made this decision using this model, right? And yes, it was a mistake. We updated the model. We're no longer making that mistake anymore, right? And so we recognize we made this model was making this mistake. We corrected it, right? And so you have proof. You have demonstrative proof to the regulator that you identified a problem, you corrected the problem. Your systems have a way to do this because that's what they want to see, right? They know everyone makes mistakes. What they want to see is that you have a process that can catch the mistakes, that will contain the mistakes, that will fix the mistakes, and that will let you move forward. How are you going to do that in this world? How are you going to demonstrate that you've identified the mistake, that you've contained the mistake, that you've corrected the mistake So how are you going to create those snapshots in time and be able to step back in time for the regulators to demonstrate that? Because we used to be able to do that.
Right.
And so that's something that we're going to have to figure out because, with these pre-trained models, this is hard. It's not an intractable problem. It's a problem where, back to what customers demand, instead of having, within versions of model, within versions of APIs where we're getting, kind of updating and minor retraining and fine tuning of these models that's going on, they're going to need to be micro versioning of these models so that JPM, Citibank, HSBC, DBS Bank, all of these banks around the world can go back and get micro versions of these models if they're really going to use them to make decisions that are regulated, or healthcare companies, because they're going to need to be able to step back and demonstrate, I caught it on version 3.5.1.1.2.1. And we caught it, we reported it, they fixed it, and then we're no longer making this problem, right? So the kind of that gets to that, that containment and, identification and containment problem. And that's true with lending, that's true with anti-money laundering, that's true with all of these things that are highly regulated as really, really important, because if you can't prove that, that can result in multi-billion-dollar fines for something like anti-money laundering, right? I mean, that's huge implications if you can't prove that for a bank.
That's right. I And so it's interesting. I do think the way we previously sort of thought about it all from inputs, our controls are inputs and maybe data movement. And now I think there is a heavier emphasis, right, on outcomes. And it's going to be an interesting change in the regulatory environment overall, but I think it also kind of speaks to measuring the degree of diversity or the degree of colonialism that exists in your outcomes. You touched upon, I know you said it was the least favorite of yours for controlling this effort, but thinking about where are we with AI governance and regulation from your perspective in terms of maturity of these organizations that claim to do it?
Well, so regulation is my least favorite place to control bias in foundation models. So I think regulation is important. So don't get me wrong. But I think in terms of controlling bias, it's not a good place to do it.
And the reason is too slow.
The reason is you shouldn't control bias in foundation models because of the global implications. Okay. So as the U.S., if we were going to legislate controlling bias in foundation models, we would put a very U.S. perspective on it.
I got you. So it's got to be something that's like equitable and worldwide.
Globally, it's got to have global. It's because that would have global implications. We're the largest economy in the world, so if we said we want models to be fair for all the U.S. protected classes, right?
So it's the United Nations for AI governance.
Right. Yeah. So you don't need to control it in the models. You control it in the output. And so that gets to what I think how we should do regulations.
Okay.
Regulation should be looking at the outcomes. So you should regulate specific use cases. It's kind of like akin to regulating Word, right? Yeah. A word processor. Nothing happens until you use it, right? You could use Word to write a poem. You could use Word to write a novel. You could use Word to write a manifesto for good. You could use Word to write instructions for how to create a biological weapon, a nuclear weapon, or a bomb. Which one of those should be regulated? Word itself or the last three? Don't let people build bombs, nuclear weapons, or biological warfare agents, right? And that's what we do today. We don't regulate the word processor. We regulate not allowing people to build those things or how they can build those things. It's no different with AI. We shouldn't regulate the foundation model themselves. We should regulate how those models are used. And the EU attempted to do that. And up until the point where OpenAI came out with ChatGPT, they were going down a really good road, and then they kind of freaked out because this ChatGPT thing came out, and they shoved some other stuff in there to try and account for it. And everything else was really well thought out, and then they kind of went haywire at the end. And then the other thing they didn't do was, they have these categories of different levels of AI. So they have high risk, medium risk, and low risk. There's not a real good definition as to what falls into what. And so it's very unclear. And so they need more clarity about what you do and how you do it. And so there's some issues with it. I think the framework is pretty good, but there's a lot of ambiguity, and ambiguity is not good. And so I think there's some good things about the EU regulation. I think they freaked out a little bit to try and get ChatGPT fit in there. And then there's been ambiguity. So if you look back when GDPR came out, right after GDPR was released, there were a bunch of working groups that were started to create clarity. There's no working groups. Everyone's sitting there going, what do I do? And no one's going to know what to do until someone gets sued at this point.
Well, it's interesting, that debate about use case versus training case, right? There's a lot of debate around it. I think the word analogy works up to a point, but then AI gets tricky when you get into AGI and you get a little bit more advanced. It works for LLMs. And so just to acknowledge that there's a debate out there, right?
Yeah, there is a debate out there.
And just the reason I bring that up, it's just to say, like, we've got a lot of opportunity at the moment. And that's really part of the regulatory discussion, is like you saw this California legislation, some of which got vetoed, some of which got accepted. And some say the big companies like your Microsoft, your OpenAI should take a more active approach in driving worldwide regulation because, as you're pointing out, it's not great to come in an emergency situation. That's when you get really kind of untenable regulation. Do you think there's more that the big companies should be doing to work with regulators?
I think they should, because as soon as something goes wrong, everyone's going to do what the EU did in January, February of 2023, and there's going to be a whole lot of countries that are kind of freaking out and do things that are not going to be good for innovation, not going to be good for the tech companies, going to hold all of this back significantly, because something is going to go wrong if there's not more control over how it's being used and how it's being implemented, more deliberate nature of how this is going on.
What's interesting, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
So yeah, I think that's interesting, and it's great to talk to you about your perspective. Certainly, you've built a lot of knowledge in the AI space, right, in the last part of your career. I wonder if your perspective is shaped at all, or maybe you could talk about your background in cellular biology, because you spent a big part of your career in a kind of different domain. Has that?
Yeah, so I'm a human geneticist by training, right? And so, I come at everything just by way of training from a human perspective, right? And so I even when I do my consulting around AI and help people build strategy, it always starts with the business, but then it quickly goes, who are the humans that are interacting with your business? And I kind of, even if you think about how I look at regulations, right? What's the outcome? Who are the humans? How are the humans going to be impacted? And then you kind of step back and say, how are their health, wealth, and livelihood? What is the health, wealth, and livelihood that's going to be impacted by these AI systems? And so absolutely my where I come from, where my core of my education, and, I spent the first 20 years of my career focused on, on human impact.
Interesting.
So
yeah.
Absolutely it does.
And I think that's, so just materially, I'd be interested to know, what do you foresee as the specific good outcomes for underrepresented cultures in AI?
So if we do it right?
Yeah.
So I think there's a few things. So I think there's one thing we didn't talk about. We talked about the globe, right? Then even within societies, I think there's a lot of underrepresented cultures, right? So you have underrepresented minorities like the Black and brown community here in the U.S., where if you look at healthcare, the Black population historically seeks healthcare at a much lower rate than the white and brown populations because of things like the Tuskegee trials. It's ingrained in their culture. We don't trust the medical system because they've experimented on us on before. Very reasonable thought process, right? And so then you also have another population who are economically disadvantaged, who don't seek healthcare because we don't have state-supported health. And so people only go. So we have large swaths of the population that don't have any healthcare data until they show up in the emergency room. And so we have these massive amounts of healthcare data that are missing. So we have a dearth of data in healthcare that represents very vulnerable parts of our population. And you see this in outcomes in healthcare. So that's one place. And AI could actually help that. So this new iteration, so foundation models are very good at creating synthetic data. And so we could look at companies are doing this. How can we create synthetic data models to help represent these underrepresented populations so that we can get better longitudinal healthcare data? So that's one thing we could do. We need to be careful about that because we need to make sure it actually represents it. But that's something that people are working on. So that's one really good outcome that could help. How can we fill in some of these data gaps from structural inequities that exist within a society? I think we can all agree.
That
that's a structural inequity in my mind.
Yeah, it's interesting.
The other area that I think could help is, so look at the legal system in the U.S. and in the West in general, right? Most of the legal system in the West relies on some version of a public defender to represent those who don't have money. And typically, if you have a public defender, you don't get as good legal support as those who can afford to pay their own. And it's not because public defenders are bad attorneys or barristers or solicitors or whatever you happen to call them. It's because they tend to be overworked. And AI could potentially help provide individuals support they need to get better legal care, especially people who can't afford to get legal care on their own. It could help these public defenders provide more capacity. And so it could help, again, vulnerable populations get access to better outcomes, in this case, legal outcomes, than they would otherwise get, which could potentially help, unskew in the U.S., especially our legal system, from being especially heavily on the black and brown population, right? Because that's another structural, again, maybe my politics are coming out, but it's another structural inequity that exists in our legal system, is that you get this cycle of primarily black and brown people getting filtered through our legal system because they don't have access to the same kind of legal support that others do.
It's interesting. Both examples, though, I think also have a real economic punchline that everyone needs to care about. I'm more familiar with medical data because I did a medical data startup in my past. And so I love what you're saying is that, there's sort of there's a cultural baked in component, right, of exclusion, particularly for, like you said, like Black people seeking medical attention. That got baked in somewhere back, and so it's part of the culture, keeps like regenerating. If you were able to address that through better representation, better understanding of, specific medical issues, then you could reduce the number of people landing in the emergency room, which I think if you don't know, I'll tell, for audience members, it's a massive vector of expense for every single person listening to this call, because mostly it's paid for by taxpayers. And it's not even really an effective place to get treated for a number of reasons. So I do think that we all care, and for these like large scale public outcomes, there's definitely a dollar oriented punchline.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to ask you a couple questions. I'll tell you my for fun question. I'll just say this ahead of time so you can think about it in the background. I'm going to ask you like what news sources and books you read to stay on top of this, so you can put that. That'll be our last question. But before we get there, a lot of times in these situations, something has to go wrong, and then people scramble to kind of get the right answer. And in reality, the people who safeguard these kind of big ideas are the practitioners, people on the ground who are doing this today. I wish all the CEOs were just in the back office with you figuring all this out, but the reality is it's the doers. What is your advice to people who right now are working at companies that want to implement AI solutions? And, maybe it's a big company, a market maker, so you do have some impact on the economy when you release AI.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things. So one is, when you're thinking about what technology to use, take a beat. Am I using the right thing, or am I using the shiny thing? You need to make sure you're using the right tool for the job and not the cool tool for the job.
Right.
And I think oftentimes, we use something like generative AI because our boss said, or the CEO or someone said, go figure out how to use generative AI, when really, you don't need it. Or even if you do need generative AI, you don't necessarily need it, like we talked about before. You don't necessarily need a large language model. You don't need the latest and greatest. Most of the time, that's not the answer. I would probably say 99% of the time or better, that's not the answer. So do you really, really need that? That's thing number one. Then thing number two, which is probably the most important, is look at who your users are and who's impacted by what you're building, and understand what their perspective is. Are you protecting them, especially the impacted people? And do the people who are building the system represent the people who are being impacted by it? Meaning that, does the diversity of the impacted population even come close to representing the diversity of the people that are building the system?
That's so interesting. I think the thing that jumped to mind when I thought about this question, and I'd be curious if this is the same in the biotech world. In finance, you have to register risks. And when you do a big project, you have to keep like a formal risk register. It goes to your regulators. And one might be, based on this conversation, Seth, if I was a practitioner, I might put, hey, we're using a model that doesn't include diverse data, or have a team that doesn't represent the, group of people who will be impacted by this. Is there something similar in other industries of risk industries?
Yeah. So when you file, I think when you file something in for various aspects for medical device and yeah, there are risk registries. Yeah.
I know it's inadequate, but it's at least something to account. Because I think the thing, one other quick question, I know I said it was going to be the last one, is like, is there a timing element here to address technological colonialism?
I think so, because I think we're saying that, if you listen to the analysts, and even if they're half right, somewhere between 15 and $20 trillion of global GDP is going to be added in the next 5 years. And what part of the worlds are going to be able to take advantage of that? And well, I guess if you want to take advantage of that, you need to sign on to the AI that's out there. And if you want to sign on to it, you're going to have to use the AI that's out there. If the AI doesn't represent your society, you're going to have the Western and or Chinese view of the world inflicted on your culture if we don't do something about it.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up. I think there's been a little bit of like sort of shrug shoulders around this, like, oh, what are you going to do? Bias exists. And I'm happy that you're talking about it, because there are ways to address it. And as you pointed out, there's people who are building these tools right now in other countries. So thank you for that. I wanted to, it's been a great conversation. And with every guest, I try to just kind of wrap up, because I think it's always interesting to just get a little insight on, the books, podcasts, other sources of information that you're going to kind of develop your opinion further in this space.
Yeah. So, I don't read any particular place. I aggregate a whole lot of different Substacks and articles, and I have a bot that goes and searches a place called archive.org, which is basically all the latest publications that come out for things that are of interest to me. And so, I read all sorts of papers on that, and then I write on my Substack called Silicon Sands News every week. And so whatever topic I write on, I go deep into, so that makes me keep up to date on those things. And so all of my reading is typically not in the form of a book. It's typically in the form of primary research papers that are coming out from various places in the world.
Great comment. I think that's so interesting. Because, I'm not, even if you're not a scientist, not a PhD or AI expert, it is really useful to take a look at some of these research papers. And, for me, like at my level, I would say I can get a third through it, and it's still useful.
Yeah, and you can even put these into you can put these in Claude or ChatGPT or something like that, and say, hey, help me understand, what does this say? I mean, they're great. They're great at summarizing things.
I like because you have an academic point of view in some ways. It's interesting. I do recommend this, that people read the real legislation, read the real documents. It seems like it wouldn't be, so much commentary happens. You feel like, why should I do that? But in fact, it is often very, very useful to me.
Yeah. And we talked about EU. By the way, there will almost definitely be a U.S. legislation in the next session. It's one area that both parties agree on, is there needs to be an AI legislation in the U.S. There almost was one this session. Almost definitely there will be in the next session, regardless of who gets in office, because there's bipartisan agreement there needs to be one. So there will, what it looks like, who knows, but there will be, I would almost put money on it, there will be AI legislation out of the U.S. next session.
Amazing. Good for us to keep an eye out for. And tip of the hat for doing a weekly newsletter. That's not easy. I'm going to definitely subscribe. Say the name of it one more time.
Silicon Sands News.
Silicon Sands News. I'll see if I can get that into the show notes as well. Seth, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Thanks for joining us on BetterTech.
Thank you, Jocelyn, for having me. Appreciate it.